Greetings, diners and fellow Collapsniks from other websites. We are back here again. We are actually skipping over part 3 for today, which is on climate and geopolitics, basically because several of our members, some of the people in the crew, have had to depart because of the great length at which we can go on and on about these things. You get a bunch of us doomers, collapsniks, whatever you want to call us, together, and we stray off into many different topics, and things can go very long. And then we also have people in far different time zones. I'm in Alaska, and it's in the early afternoon my time, but in Central Europe, it's past midnight now. And so we have people that have to work on Monday, and so forth. So and other people even here who, you know, budgeted a certain amount of time for our chat, but we have gone way over that, even in just doing two sections to this broadcast. So we are going to do the final part, which is futurology, which is a sort of look at some possibilities for the future, whether they are plausible or implausible, and so forth, and how we prognosticate the events that are going to unfold over time here. And remaining with me in this segment and in here for the long haul are Nicole Foss from The Automatic Earth, Gail Tverberg from Our Finite World, and my co-host Monsta. As far as part 3 goes, we will try to record that one sometime during this week and get a few of the people back who had to leave for that. So you'll have to wait for part 3. But they will all be up eventually whenever it does get recorded, and will be listenable to on another occasion. If any of you are listening live still, and I'm sure there aren't too many after this length of time, I'm glad that you came by to listen to us go through this business, and hope you've enjoyed what we've done so far. So, with that said, Mansa, take it away. Let's talk about renewable energy.
Yeah, so this part of the debate, like Ari said, is about the future, and mainly about the possible solutions that are often touted in the future. And one of the big areas is renewable energy. And the hope is that as fossil fuels become unaffordable to dig up, that we will be able to switch to renewable forms of energy, such as photovoltaic panels, wind power, and so forth. I was just wondering, how could such forms of energy be utilized, and how much of our current technological society can be maintained with renewables? What's your thoughts on that, Nicole?
I don't think you run a technological society on renewable energy, period. So renewable energy tends to be lower energy profit ratio. It's very variable, but the major point is that if you look at what constitutes renewable energy, how much of it is actually renewable? I mean, yes, the sun will keep shining and the wind will keep blowing, but concrete and cement and rebar and rare earth metals are not renewable. And the energy that is required to make photovoltaic panels and enormous wind turbines comes from fossil fuels, from high energy profit ratio fossil fuels. So there's a tremendous dependence on the existence of fossil fuels in order to be able to construct renewable energy in the way that we currently envisage it. So we tend to think of renewable energy in terms of either, say, biofuels or things that generate electricity, renewable power. Now, you do not run a power grid on distributed, non-dispatchable energy sources. You can get away with perhaps 15% of your power grid being non-dispatchable before you start to lose the ability to control frequency and voltage. You have a whole range of aspects as to how a power system has to work that don't come from things like solar and wind that are non-dispatchable. You need ancillary services. You need black start. You need reactive power, frequency management. Balancing supply and demand in real time gives you the ability to manage frequency on the system. You need to control voltage. For these things, you need large systems with a decent amount of inertia. You don't control aspects like that of a power system with very small scale distributed non-dispatchable generation. You have to have something that looks like baseload that you can ramp up and down. So you have baseload and you have peaking plant, but you have to be able to control the plant that you have if you're going to have a power system where you can manage the parameters you need to manage. So I look at when people suggest we're going to have a completely renewable energy-based grid, I think well, it's completely inconceivable. The grid that you would need to do that doesn't exist. We have a grid that's designed to, it's a central station model. It's designed to carry power from a few central large-scale locations to distribute it broadly for distributed demand. But even when you look at how distributed demand currently is, it's not completely distributed. Yes, there are individual households, but you have tremendous concentrations of demand as well. You have industrial factories and things like that. Huge cities are concentrations of demand. If you turn supply into a distributed form of supply, you can't supply concentrated demand. You don't have the grid infrastructure that you would need to do that. And in fact, the grid infrastructure we do have is at or near the end of its design life in a lot of cases. So not only would we have to have a massive grid build-out, we would also have to replace a lot of the infrastructure that we currently have. And people talk about smart grids and how we, well, it doesn't matter if sources are non-dispatchable because we'll just balance one source with something else, and of course we'll come up with some magical energy storage mechanism that converts everything into being dispatchable anyway. Unfortunately, this is just profoundly unrealistic. Energy storage is extremely expensive, not just in money terms, but in energy terms. What you do when you run renewable energy through a power grid system with built-in energy storage is you minimize what was already a relatively low energy profit ratio. And with the kind of energy dependence on that you would build into that kind of system for maintaining that grid infrastructure, you've almost certainly reduced your energy profit ratio below 1. In other words, you're not going to be able to sustain power grids in a modern sense if you're trying to run it on low energy profit ratio sources of any kind. And when you add in the non-dispatchability of renewables and the tremendous fossil fuel dependence on producing energy that way, it's just a complete non-starter from the beginning. Now, this is not to say that you can't have a renewable energy-based economy. Of course you can. We always did until the Industrial Revolution. The kicker is it doesn't look like this society. It's this society that we can't run on renewable sources, especially if we insist on using them in the most complex technological way. We're not going to be able to maintain current levels of socioeconomic complexity in a low energy profit ratio era. So in order to use renewables, we will have to use them simply, the way people did in the past. So you don't need electricity for an awful lot of things. You can have thermal energy. You can have motive power. If you look at the windmills that were all over Holland, where I happen to be at the moment, they weren't generating electricity. They were turning mill wheels to grind grain. But they were still using renewable energy for an extremely important social purpose. So you can just use renewable energy in lower tech ways. You can have compressed air systems like Paris used to run on. There are so many elegant ways of using a distributed renewable energy that people used in the past, and I think those are the kinds of things that we're going to be going back to in an era when we're living in a simpler society. So of course it will be renewable. I'm not suggesting that there's no future for renewable energy, but I am suggesting there's a very limited future for high-tech renewable energy. And I think there's going to be essentially no future at all for smart grids and electric cars and and all these fancy kind of utility scale battery systems that people discuss at the moment. I think that's going to be a non-starter. It's far too late to start converting to some of these things. There are some ways that you can use energy storage that already exist. You can back off hydropower, for instance. So if you happen to have a whole lot of hydropower like they do in Scandinavia, for instance, then yes, you've got energy storage. And so there are ways you can build storage into the system, but it's expensive to do it if you don't already have it. That's really the point. So there will be some ways in which you can maintain grid systems in places where you have more natural advantages. But there are a lot of places where it's simply not going to be possible. You know, one example that I really find quite interesting is when people talk about how Denmark generates sometimes all of its energy from wind power, and how this is a wonderful advertisement for the potential of renewable energy. But if you look at what happens in Denmark, Denmark is not isolated. It's part of the entire Western European grid. And the Western European grid as a whole has much less than the 15% renewable energy, that non-dispatchable renewable energy that is your limit before you start destabilizing the system. So Denmark can have a lot of wind because other places don't, because other places have thermal plants, and you're balancing the renewables with other things in order to run your whole Western European grid. But it's interesting that when Denmark produces an excess of power, they sell it very cheaply to places like Sweden, where they have the storage component, because that's where they have the hydro that they back off when the wind is blowing. So they sell their surplus very cheaply. If they have a deficit because the wind isn't blowing, they buy it back from Sweden very expensively. So the lesson in that is he who owns the storage component controls the economics of the system. So it's not the Danes who benefit economically, particularly from their wind power. It's the people who own the hydropower. So there are aspects to the way the system works that I think people often fail to appreciate. So I think we really desperately need to understand how power systems actually work, what parameters you have to control, the degree of complexity that's required to maintain power systems, the dependence on fossil fuels. We have to understand all of these aspects in order to know what is and is not possible to do with renewable energy. And I'm all for moving to a renewable energy future, but as I've written about before, solution space does not include complex solutions that depend on high energy profit ratio energy sources and existing levels of socioeconomic complexity. If we're going to work within solution space, we have to be realistic and look at what renewable energy can realistically do, which is a lot. It's just not going to include running technological civilization.
One of the arguments that they do make in regards to renewables is, that you mentioned the smart grid, but then there's also, the super large grids, like, there's talk in Europe that they will connect the grids from various countries. So, for example, if there's windmills in England, they will connect with Norway, and Norway.
For $500 billion to build an interconnector so that the Scots can also subsidize the Scandinavian owners of the energy storage. And the amount of energy that it would take to build that European supergrid is more than you will ever get from those wind turbines that they're thinking of building the supergrid with. It's a complete techno fantasy of the worst possible kind. They haven't thought about the grid infrastructure significantly at all, and they just have no concept of the energy it would take to construct that kind of offshore wind-based supergrid. It is just utterly inconceivable that they're going to complete this project. I've written essays on this issue specifically, if you're interested in any more information on it.
Well, you can add links to that, or I will add the links once it goes up on YouTube for that. Mm-hmm. So sure. If you send them to me for anybody who views it on YouTube. Gail, what about you?
Well, I would agree pretty much 100% with Nicole. I think there's a couple of aspects. One of it is that politicians have a real need to have something to tell us about and something that's good news. So you put out lots of RFPs, requests for proposals, and lots of grant money for studies on this, that, and the other thing, and everyone comes back with, well, maybe we could do this and maybe we could do that, and they put it all together and it looks so wonderful. And as long as you don't understand what's going on, it's just something that fills the airwaves and it fills politicians' pockets, and it's wonderful. The other side of the thing that kind of makes people happy is there are a certain number of people who say, well, I'm going to make it through whatever bottleneck we're coming up with, and if I have some solar panels and if I have, some other things, I'm going to be better off than other people on making it through this bottleneck. Okay, well, if I can get the taxpayers to subsidize my solar panels, I'm so much better off. And they don't even stop to think that if they're connected to the grid, it's going to take a whole lot of doing to make them usable otherwise, and then they have to have devices and backup storage if they're going to use them separately. But their view is it's going to benefit me whether or not it does anything for the grid at all. So I can see that these people would like this, but I don't really see why taxpayers in general should be subsidizing these people. If they want these things, they should pay the full dollar amount for them. It's not really helping the grid. I guess the third thing I might add is on these energy profit ratios. The energy profit ratios are put together assuming that these devices are going to last 20, 30 years, whatever the forecast life of these devices are. Well, that's only if you could actually keep the whole system running. If you can't, it's like throwing the energy away that you're using for those. If there's something that we can no longer use after 2, 3, or 5 years, it's very much less useful than what these models that people have put together seem to suggest.
Yeah. Well, from looking at it from both points of view, I mean, I tend to agree with both of you guys, but I think first, let's start with the fact that as non-starters go, the idea of trying to build big grid style renewable energy it's absurd. It's not so much the equipment or even the storage medium, although that is an important part, but it's the infrastructure of the wiring and the transformers and transporting electric power over many miles between different places all the time. This level of complexity is just totally unsustainable. We can't maintain the grid as it is, much less build it out and make it bigger. And so that's just not going to happen. But when you start to look at the people who are pro renewables and who support them, and Nicole mentioned this, I think the ones that are most rational are the ones that are talking about distributed systems, small systems, and whatnot. And they don't have to be personal size; they can be small community size. You just can't you can't be busying yourself transporting tons of electricity around miles and miles of territory, and it has to be used in a much more sensible manner too. The fact is, I wrote an article a while back about porch lights. I went out on my back porch and I looked around at a dozen other places, and everybody had a light on all night. And then I went onto Google Earth, or actually, just Googled up pictures of NASA from space and whatnot, looking at the Earth, and it's like a fucking Christmas tree at night. You've got thousands and thousands of lights burning all night in cities and towns and people's back porches all over the place. The waste is incredible, and it's actually encouraged. You go to Christmas time and you see everybody's got these lights decorating their house, just burning electricity for no reason whatsoever. So you know, we are burning up and wasting a tremendous amount of electricity that is utterly unnecessary. The amount of electricity that you really need to use is extremely small to, you know, maintain at least a semblance of our current lifestyle. The other aspect of where electricity gets used up in tremendous amounts is in the production of things like aluminum. That is a highly intensive electrically generated process for producing aluminum from bauxite. And so, and then the production of automobiles and spot welding and, oh my God, you name it, in the industrial type of society, the amount of electrical energy that gets burned up in these types of processes that are tremendously energy intensive. You get rid of those energy intensive processes, you get rid of the long transmission lines, and you localize what you're doing, and then, you know, the renewables, even electrical renewables, do become somewhat more plausible. Yes, it is true that to manufacture those things, you need fossil fuels. But the idea here would be that you stop burning up and wasting fossil fuels, as Steve says, driving around willy-nilly for no reason, and reserve what fossil fuels you have left for production of these things. And so, in so doing, you sort of extend out the time that these type of things can be used. But that being said, so, you know, I think there's a place on a transitionary level for small-scale photovoltaics. And
DC, and then you don't need inverters, because inverters are going to be the weak link almost all the time. So yes, I totally agree that you can have small-scale distributed systems, and if you can have individual scale or community scale, and if you're running them DC, so that you're not having to build in some of the complexity, then you will be able to run that system for longer. And of course, there's some things that you need AC for, but there's an awful lot that you can do DC that makes an enormous difference. So if you're running small-scale systems that are not grid connected, that are freestanding, these are the sorts of things that are going to last for really quite a long time. Solar panels will last quite a while, but the inverter will not. If you blow a charge controller and then you can't use your system because you have no way of repairing it, then your system is useless. So it's a question of getting out from under as much of the complexity as you possibly can. And I do think we'll use photovoltaic panels as transitional mechanisms, especially in areas that are rural and in places where it's not going to make any sense to maintain grid connections. It's just going to be far too expensive. And I think what we need to do is learn from the way that they're doing these things in the third world, where they don't have the big networks in a lot of the rural parts of the third world, but even being able to run, say, one light bulb in a house so that kids can do their homework after dark makes an enormous difference to quality of life and what people are capable of doing. So you don't have to have a complex grid-connected system with all these extra aspects of complexity that are minimizing your energy profit ratio. You can do it without that. Yes, it's still too technologically complex to be a long-term thing, but it can be a very useful transitional thing, and it can make a very big difference even with very small amounts of electricity in places that aren't going to have any other options. So it's a question of time frames. I do think some of these things will exist for a while, but if we can build them in the least technologically complex way, small scale and adjacent to demand, then you maximize the energy profit ratio and you will get the most bang for your energy buck, so to speak. So I think there are ways to do this that make sense. I would still like to see renewable energy only used for electricity where it is truly electricity that's necessary. So if we want thermal energy, we should not be generating electricity to then run an immersion heater to heat hot water, which some people do. This is insane. Just use the energy directly to heat the water. There are ways of doing it that are much, much simpler. And I would like to see us use renewable energy in the simplest ways we possibly can in order to maximize the energy profit ratio across the board. We will be able to make the transition phase a lot more comfortable if we do it that way, rather than throwing what fossil fuel energy we have left at things that are just fundamentally unworkable in every sense.
Well, you know, our crowd is a big 12-volt crowd. Myself and Eddie are both 12-volt freaks, and I personally have identified, you know, for myself precisely, you know, what I need, and I can do it all 12. You know, I need one light. I run my laptop is run 12-volt, and my refrigerator I can run 12-volt. You know, I mean, all you need is a motor to compress, and you can get DC motors. So
yeah, well pumps as well. You can run you can get DC well pumps.
Yeah. So you know, there and those, you know, in terms of your household, you know, refrigeration, light, communications. Those are the necessary aspects of electricity that you need. But all the rest of the stuff is nonsense. You know, I mean, people who run electric ranges in their houses, I mean, that's just insane. You know, like I said, just the industrial culture and the amount of electricity that's wasted that way, and then all the waste across the grid, it's just tremendous. So we definitely do need to move in that direction. Okay, Mansa, what's the next topic?
So the next one is in regards to building communities, and yes, it's my feeling that as things progress, society and societal structures will break down into smaller, localized structures, which will become the predominant scene. And this will apply to things like food production and the distribution of other resources. Now, I was just wondering, you know, how can these communities come together, in particular, you know, when the main structures, like the main political centralized structures, fail? How can we get localized communities to work together and not tear each other's throats, as it were? You know, what are your suggestions, Ari?
Well, I was actually hoping that Nicole would take the lead on this one. Because she recently wrote a very long piece on solution space, and you know, there are some interesting aspects that I want to pick up on that, but I think I want to let her go first on this issue and hear what she has to say before I pontificate.
Certainly. Well, I just wanted to sort of set the scene in a sense that right now we operate at very large scale. We've forced everything to scale up in our expansion. We have increased the scale at which we did absolutely everything. And every time we move to a larger scale, we basically climbed a ladder and kicked out the rungs underneath us as we went up. So we've made it very difficult to get back down to where we were, but we're nevertheless going to have to do it because the scale at which we currently operate, sort of large scale, global scale, civilizational scale, is not going to work in an era of a much lower energy and much lower complexity. So the future is going to be small scale inherently. We're going to find that effective organizational scale is very much smaller. When we have periods of contraction, this will be economic contraction, but also contraction forced in the longer term by less energy than we have now and less complexity. When you have contraction, trust disappears. And trust really is a major determining factor of effective organizational scale. So we're going to see effective organizational scale get quite small, and this means that community is going to be absolutely critical because you won't be able to depend on solutions coming from the top down, on large-scale government policy introduced kinds of supposed solutions. These things are really not going to work. I think large-scale political institutions will be doing more to cause trouble as expensively as possible than providing any actual solutions. But there's a tremendous potential for solutions from the bottom up at the grassroots in ways that are cheap and accountable and transparent and much more effective because they're based on personal trust. They're based on knowing people face to face. And if you do that, you can work with people incredibly effectively. You're not depending on trust in an institutional framework, because it's trust in the institutional framework that won't be sustainable. But trust in other human beings who you know personally is sustainable. It just helps very much if you establish it before everything gets difficult, because otherwise you'll be peering at each other over walls of suspicion, and it's much, much harder to build community then. But absolutely we can and we should be building community right now. There are so many ways people can come together, and anything you come together to do is going to build social capital and relationships of trust. And relationships of trust are the absolute foundation of society at all times. So you can come together for permaculture programs or community gardening, time banking, building alternative currencies, setting up alternative trading arrangements, setting up maker spaces, where people are sharing equipment to produce things for everybody's benefit. You can have community hubs. You can engage in asset mapping exercises. There are just a plethora of alternatives, of ways that you can bring people together to work on common objectives. You can have a cleanup day where everybody comes together to reclaim a community asset, for instance. The list is almost endless as to ways that you can bring people together that will build relationships of trust. And once you've got those relationships of trust, those can be a really good foundation for alternative trading arrangements. So alternative trading arrangements are critical when you move into an era when there's going to be so little money around. So we were talking in the previous segment about the fact that we're facing a gargantuan financial crash, an economic depression, crash in the velocity of money. There will be very, very little money in circulation. Very little economic activity will be able to be supported under those circumstances. However, if you can come up with some other thing that serves the function of liquidity, you do not have to live to the same extent in the state of artificial scarcity that you would normally have to live through in a liquidity crunch. So a liquidity crunch creates artificial scarcity because you still have all the people you had before and the resources you had before, but now you can't do anything with them because you've crashed the money supply. So in the 1930s, people said, we had everything except money. And it was true, they did. Because they'd crashed their operating system, they couldn't do anything with the resources they had. So we're going to be moving through that kind of scenario again. What we have to do is find alternative forms of liquidity in order to alleviate the condition of liquidity crunch so that we can actually be able to function through this kind of period. So we're looking at alternative currencies, barter arrangements, time banks where we're trading time and skills with each other more broadly than we would be able to if we were just doing it one-on-one. If you can set these systems up in advance, they can be tremendously powerful, and they work within the trust horizon. So alternative currencies, by definition, work within the trust horizon because they're fiat currencies. So they're tremendously valuable to set up now. It's not just that you need them in the crunch period. They're useful now to extend the money supply, to allow a greater degree of economic activity to be supported than would otherwise be able to be supported, because you're supplementing the money supply with something that's only liquidity in a local area, and therefore it can't leave. So you create captive demand in a local area that then encourages the development of captive supply within a local area. So you've got local supply chains, local distribution networks. You set something like that up now, and those the kinds of businesses that will arise to serve that situation are the kinds of things that are likely to survive a crunch because they don't have the same dependencies on things that come from outside, or they don't have the same dependency on having to send goods outside. So you're not feeding into the extractive economy in anything like the same way. You build the foundation for being able to operate things locally. That can be done now. It is being done now. These are the kind of things that amount to workable solutions because they can be done with very, very minimal amounts of resources. The main resource is human energy and input and enthusiasm. And there's tremendous amount that can be set up using that, and it can function tremendously well. You look at Greece now, and they're using alternative currencies. They did in Argentina as well in their financial crisis. So we just have to find ways to navigate the liquidity crunch, and all of those ways are going to be small scale and community based. So it's an absolutely critical part of solution space.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Melissa.
No, I wasn't going to say anything. You go ahead.
All right. Basically, you know, we've been looking at this problem ourselves from, you know, a point of view of how do you get people who are used to the current system, the current monetary system, the current industrial type of lifestyle, how do you bring these people together and form community so that you can hit these proper solution spaces? You know, it occurred to a couple of us how remarkably the Sun Project, which is our nonprofit arm, how closely it matched with your solution space. You know, it's virtually identical, actually. And you know, the deal here is that you've got a culture of people, a group of people that have been raised up in such a way that they become very separate, and bringing together these people to live in a different way, to cooperate with each other, to not depend on the current monetary system for stuff that they're doing and ways that they live, to try to back off of it. Nobody can get off of the train completely as long as the system is running. That it is absolutely impossible to do that. There's almost nowhere on earth that even a solo Bear Grylls type can go these days and make it. So you're whatever happens, you're going to be depending on other people, and in order to do this, you have to find those other people and you have to form your communities. And while it's nice if you can do it in your neighborhood or through your church and hometown, whatever, if you live in that kind of environment, that's great. But a vast majority of people don't. They live in big cities that are very impersonal, and for them to try to come together in these ways and even do simple things like, you know, a quilting party or something like that, they just don't do those things anymore. You know what I'm saying? So there is this this problem of reorienting mindset, and then finding people. So we have a kind of a two-pronged attack on that, a two-pronged approach, which is through the internet as one means, and you know, finding the contacts and bringing together the people on the cyber level, the intellectual ideas, and then progressing from there to the real life level and developing a sort of a cellular set of communities, not just one community, but a bunch of cells that all can operate on, you know, basically independent principles based on who gets involved in that type of community. So there is not a fixed idea. You know, a lot of religious communities, so forth, you have to buy into a certain fixed religious belief, and those are often the most successful communities, by the way, are ones that everybody buys into the same religion. But that's not where we're at. We're trying to make it more flexible, but yet at the same time, you know, everybody that gets involved in a community structure has to be able to operate together, and so work from the same set of principles. So developing that set of principles is an important part of the Sun Project, and that's what we talk about there. And by the way, I would encourage people to drop by Sun and donate. We're a nonprofit, 501c3, so it's tax deductible, and help us develop these ideas into the future. But it's definitely not something that's going to come from the top down, from the government. The solution space is not with the big organizational systems that we currently have running, and that some people think are, you know, perennial, but they can never die. You know, that these systems are going to be with us forever. The rich will always be rich, and so forth. You know, but this is not true. System side, civilization side, people die, and so you have to be aware that what you have known and the things that you believed to be true can change, and when they do change, you have to be prepared for those changes. So, you know,
it's going to be critically important to get expectations in line with what reality can hope to deliver, because there is nothing more dangerous than collectively dashed expectations. And that's exactly what we're going to be facing on a very, very large scale. So it is going to be difficult to find the right people. Not everybody's going to do this. Not even more than a tiny percentage of people are going to come together and form real community. But the people who do will be tremendously better off, because there's no point in surrounding yourself with guns and ammo and high fences and dogs and thinking you're self-sufficient because you've got a basin full of food. That sort of thing is ridiculous. If everyone around you is hungry, then you're not going to last very long. If you can build community and take people with you, then there's so much more that you can do. And pooling resources is just always going to be the more effective way of going about it. But it will be hard to find the right people. And you're right that often religious communities are the most successful because they're prepared to submit to what they regard as a higher authority. They don't think of it as being bossed around and told what to do by other human beings. They think that they're being told what to do by higher power, and they are perfectly prepared to go along with that. It glues them together in important ways. But at the same time, it's not for everybody by any stretch of the imagination. But if you're going to try and do it with secular ideas, unite people with secular ideas, it is somewhat harder because people do tend to feel that other people are bossing them around, and they tend to resent it. So you have to be very careful to make sure that you are on the same page and that you have a kind of horizontal organizational structure where you don't have people feeling that they're being dictated to or that they don't have any say. Or, well, I should rephrase that. You can have a totally dictatorial system if people will accept it, but the alternative is to have a much more open horizontal structure. It's things in the middle that don't tend to work so terribly well. Because if you have enough dictatorialism to boss people around and make them resent it, but not enough to be effective, then you lose right from the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, it is very important to have resilience in the community, and one of the big reasons is not just purely on the practical side, like building enough food, but just being resilient in the sense of being mentally prepared. Because the issue I see is this, like, as we go forward, there are going to be pressures against people. Like, you just look at the situation today, for example, you know, people, they're losing their jobs, they're losing their homes, you know, the number of people going to food banks is exploding, and the number, and this is also reflected in suicide rates. And, you know, when these issues become really big, it's going to pose real issues for communities. You know, how can communities stand up to these shocks? And that's where the very word resilience takes on a different meaning. Well, it's the same meaning, but on a different level, I should say. You know, what are your feelings about these pressures that could tear a group apart, potentially?
There are going to be very significant pressures tearing groups apart. So this is really part of the whole psychology of collapse issue. So if it's all right, we could get into to that side of things. The problem is that as hard as it is to share gains in any way perceived to be fair, it is much harder to share losses. When the pie is shrinking, people don't want to lose something. They want the same size of piece of pie that they had before. And if the pie is shrinking and they can't have that anymore, they're going to resent it enormously. So what you end up with is a situation where people are trying to grab for what they perceive to be their fair share, even although they're actually grabbing for what would be more than their fair share when the pie is shrinking, and everybody wants what they had before. And you just set up a tremendously competitive environment where trust is disappearing and you get more competition than cooperation. When you're in a state of contraction, it's the negative side of human nature that's in control. It's fear, it's anger, it's resentment, it's suspicion. These are the things that are really corrosive, really hard on the fabric of society. Now, cooperation will be every bit as important as it ever was, if not more so, but it will be harder. And it will be even harder to do it at scale. Cooperation at scale is not going to work. But cooperation within small groups absolutely can still work. It's just that you really need to establish the trust that it would be based on before you get to the point where push comes to shove. So if you've set up your community's scenario, even if you've only just begun, it's better than not having begun at all, then you have something that you can build on. So it's not that you will entirely lose the cooperative spirit, but that the scale at which the cooperative spirit can effectively operate will be a lot smaller than it was before. So you have to understand and anticipate that and know that you will be working against a headwind of growing fear and anger, rising discount rates, in other words, increasing short-termism, increasing state of crisis management, more of a sense that there's not enough to go around, so you have to grab things. And it is going to be harder, inevitably, to maintain the cooperative spirit, but it has to be done. And I would really like to see, as part of Solution Space, a partnership between bottom-up grassroots initiatives and municipal government, in other words, local area government, because it's possible, it's no guarantee, but it's possible that local government might still lie within the trust horizon. National government and larger forms of governance will be stranded assets from a trust perspective. They will have lost political legitimacy and they will no longer be effective. It's possible that municipal government may still lie within the trust horizon. If it does, then it will allow grassroots solutions to scale up at least to the level of neighborhoods, probably not whole cities, but small towns and neighborhoods within cities. And things like that make a tremendous difference, because then you're working at a level of cooperation that's a larger scale than you could otherwise accomplish. And local government is capable of doling out land, access to space, it's able to facilitate grassroots initiatives, to spread best practice from one place to another. It's able to deploy resources. It's able to decide how scarce resources should be rationed in ways that make more sense and that allow for fewer bruised feelings. Because if people don't feel they're being completely excluded, if they feel that they're stakeholders and they're being listened to, which is conceivable, it's not guaranteed, but it's conceivable that this might happen at a local level, then things will function more effectively. And it's a way of getting through the crunch period. But we do have to be aware that there will be this headwind of negative human emotions that we will be fighting against. An awful lot of people assume that solutions that depend on current levels of cooperation are going to be feasible, and unfortunately I really don't think they are. I would love it if they were, but I really don't think that we're going to see the level of large-scale cooperation that we currently have. So I think we have to work with what reality is going to give us, but try to undercut anything that encourages fear and anger. So it alarms me, for instance, when people say we must get people absolutely terrified about climate change, for instance, or any other issue, but I just happen to have heard people talk about climate change in that sense recently, that we must get people terrified about it because then something will happen. we do not need to encourage people to be afraid. Fear will get plenty of traction all by itself. And if we try and encourage fear, it's going to get away from us and take off in directions and on a scale that we will not ever be able to control. So we should not be trying to encourage fear and anger. We should be trying to undermine them whenever we possibly can to keep more people in a constructive headspace. Because if you're in a constructive headspace, you have a sense of purpose, you know what you're trying to do, you know why you're trying to do it, you know why you're trying to work with other people to achieve common goals, then it's a tremendous antidote to depression, because you are moving forward, putting one foot in front of another, and you're not getting distracted with all the anger and fear around you that would otherwise just give political mandates to extremists. So it's about keeping people away from those larger scale movements that are going to be about revenge and stringing bankers up from trees and all the sorts of things that people are going to be wanting to do. None of that is going to help. All of it will damage people's ability to actually get through a crunch. So we need to let that go and not think about revenge, but think about trying to make things work as best we can in the circumstances in which we find ourselves, and that's going to involve a whole lot of small-scale cooperation, and that's going to be the most important thing we could possibly do to move forward.
Well, the aspect of fear mongering and so forth, that's already apparent in folks like Donald Trump running for president. And you have a lot of xenophobia that is currently ongoing. It's another big social psychological effect of people despising the other, the people who are coming from outside, who want what they have or think they have, and so forth. And so, that boils down to fight over resources for bunches of people, different bunches of people. And then, you have this aspect of the mental disconnect that people have, cognitive dissonance between what reality is and what the future actually holds, and what their present, in many cases, actually holds. And as a result, you get things like the mass shootings that for a while we had 142 days and 142 mass shootings. So these are, all psychological effects of an ongoing collapse. And, people attribute them to other things if they don't see the big picture. But once you do see the big picture, you can kind of see the connection between all of them.
It's dashed expectations in the middle class that lead to mass shootings on the whole. It's not poor people who go out and do these things. They tend to be more fatalistic. They don't tend to think of themselves as having agency in the first place, so they don't tend to go out and do this. But you take a whole lot of middle class people who thought the world owed them a living at their current standard of living, and then tell them, I'm sorry, but you can't have any of that. And they get angry really quickly, and you get a whole lot of young people who feel their future's been taken away from them, the future they thought they were promised, and they do dire things like go out and shoot people. And I think it's absolutely tragic, but I think we're going to see more of that, because dashed expectations are going to be incredibly common. Yeah,
it is an unfortunate aspect of the whole collapse dynamic, and a sea change in the cultural paradigm, that those effects are going to be a greater and greater part of our lives. I think as time goes by here, and again, trying to stay away or stay out of those effects, stay out of the way of them if you can, and maintain your own positive state of mind. You mentioned before the fatalistic crowd and the climate change crowd, and make people afraid and all the rest of it. Well, there's really nothing we can do about climate change.
That's right.
It's not going to stop. Virtually no matter what we do. We're not going to stop burning industrial fuels on a dime, and we are going to have substantially more climate change than we've already had. It's going to continue on. What we have to do is think positive. How can we adapt? How can we make our way through of that period of climate change? What are the positive steps that we can take as things change, rather than just sort of capitulating, becoming hopeless, and saying well, it's all over and all the rest of that. That's just it's a depressing way to live.
Yes, it is. And one of the things that I get particularly concerned about when people talk about climate change and how we must do these large-scale, gargantuan things to change the way we do everything, I think for starters it's unrealistic. We're not going to really achieve anything by doing it. But when I look at the kind of things that are most likely to happen if the larger scale entities did suddenly decide that they wanted to do something about climate change, almost every single thing they would do would end up putting lots more money in the pockets of the few and generating a whole lot of emissions in the process. Be things like carbon trading Ponzi schemes, a large-scale geoengineering. Let's mess with something we don't understand nearly well enough with a blunt instrument and see what happens. That's the sort of thing that human beings do. All these things will enrich the few. Or let's build $6 billion tidal barrages around New York City. And all these sorts of things are going to make everything worse. They're part of where we've come from. They're not adaptations in any kind of way that we need to actually implement. So when I look at the kind of things human beings would be most likely to attempt, if they started to look at climate change as being something you must address with these large-scale top-down mechanisms, then I think every one of the mechanisms that they would introduce would actually make things significantly worse, and not just from a point of view of climate, but from a much broader perspective than that, and they would continue to enrich the few at the expense of everyone else.
Yeah, I mean, that's always the danger with these things, that like you said, when the government, before they lose legitimacy, they will most likely try things that are counterproductive in the long run. And one of the main things I could see them is they can cause fear and fear-mongering, and then they can split people into groups, us against them, and then that creates its own bad dynamics. But I think the toughest question, and it's just something that people have on their mind, is what can we do about it? And part of that question is tied into what sort of timeline, how much time do we have to prepare? There's a lot of people who suggest that this could be a fast collapse scenario, whereas others, they will say it's a long emergency. This is something that Jim Counselor and John Michael Greer, they generally prescribe to, with a slow catabolic collapse. Now, what I'm trying to say is, say you have a job and it's dependent on the current system, like the current business as usual working, or you live in an area that's highly suspect, like Las Vegas. What can you do about it? Like, how can you move from that situation to something that's more sustainable? What are your thoughts on that kind of thing, Gail?
So you're talking more generally about the future, or you're talking about what a particular person can do, or what here?
So I'm just talking about like transitioning, really. So like, say you are in a situation where you've got a job that's dependent on business as usual, and you feel there's no future in that job. How would you, maneuver yourself as you will?
Well, I think you need to start doing some reading to see what, if you can see something that might work better. I guess the way I see what's coming up is financial collapse, which is related to banks not working. So, you sit down and you figure out, well, where would I do better if my bank isn't working? If I don't, if I'm like Greece, I get, whatever, $100, whenever they decide to give it to me from my bank, no matter how much I've got in it. Sometimes it's easy to think that we're running away from high-priced oil, but that's not what we're running away from. What we're running away from is a financial system that's not working. I can see, if you know that there's specifically not enough water, that's going to be a problem whether or not the financial system is working. So I can understand why you might want to move elsewhere, but at the same time, you've got to have a job to support yourself, and these other places are going to have to be willing to take you on. We can't just move all of California plus all of Las Vegas over to Ohio because it has more water. So it's sort of a matter of looking at the situation and trying to see if you can see something that would be better for yourself. But the big issue is financial, and it doesn't lend itself to quite the same kind of transition that something, driving a Prius does.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big problem, and this is something that's been repeated earlier in the discussion, is, this is as much to do with scarce resources as it is to do with a luggage of expectations. I think people, they expect a certain standard of living, and it's adjusting to this new standard that's going to be a big challenge. But still, the question remains about how you transition from what you've currently got to something that's more sustainable, even if that involves mental adjustments as well. Do you have any ideas, Nicole, on how somebody can go from a business as usual type of job to something that's more that's got more of a long-term future?
Well, I think we need to look at the kind of things that we do for a living, and if they're obviously not going to be depression-proof forms of employment, then we really need to find some other way of earning a living, and sooner rather than later would be a good thing. So I think we need to look for depression-proof or depression-resistant kinds of employment, and to say, how can we take what skills we have and find a way of using those skills that people will find useful in hard times. So try to position yourself to provide essential services. So practical skills are going to be absolutely huge. Building things, fixing things, growing things. There's going to be so much demand for people with clever hands to make things continue to work. All those will be barterable skills. Even if there isn't any money around, you will eat if you have skills like that. So things like that are useful. Medical skills, for instance, or human skills, like being able to organize things and administer things, mediation, for instance. So being able to take two opposing groups who are fighting over a shrinking pie and trying to help them see each other's point of view so that they feel more that they're all part of the same system and they would do better to cooperate than to compete with each other. If you're a skilled mediator, you can achieve things like that. It's not you'll ever have a 100% success rate, but it can be tremendously better than the alternative. Things like even entertainment can be really, really useful. That seems to fit some people's personalities. Giving people escapism and relief from whatever's going on in their life that's particularly challenging can be incredibly valuable. Being able to make the things that people need, that they would currently typically get from China or somewhere else, being able to make those basic things can be incredibly important. So I think we need to position ourselves in advance to use our skills to best effect. And we absolutely have to avoid, if we're young, getting into heaps of debt to get the training that we would need. It's interesting that more people are looking to choose apprenticeships and things now than they did before, particularly in the United States. I would say unless you get a free ride, don't even think about going to college, because you're going to rack up tens of thousands of dollars of debt and graduate into 50+% youth unemployment, and you'll never be able to pay that off, and you'll never be able to declare bankruptcy on those debts either. So people have to be incredibly careful when they choose how they want to obtain the skills that they're going to need, and not buy into the current system in order to achieve those skills. There's no need to do that. There are plenty of people who have skills that you can learn from. And it's not going to be the kind of things you would learn in college typically that are going to be particularly useful anyway. I think it's going to be much more the kind of things that you would learn in a hands-on kind of experience. And when you were asking earlier about what you would do if you lived in Las Vegas, I would have to say leave as soon as you possibly can. Las Vegas has no future. So there are some places where it simply is kind of bleak, I'm afraid. And that's not to say, obviously, that everybody could go somewhere else. As Gail said, you can't just put all of California in Ohio. But at an individual level, people are going to have to move and vote with their feet, which is, of course, what we're seeing in Europe at the moment on a very large scale. People are leaving North Africa and the Middle East and places that are not viable at the moment, and they're going to places that they feel to be more viable. I think we're going to see huge amounts of migration in that way, because we have a lot of people, and there are going to be resource constraints in a lot of areas, or economic constraints in other areas. Well, economic constraints will be everywhere. Resource constraints will be in some places, but people will be moving all over the place trying to find better circumstances than they currently have. People don't just sit in one place if it isn't working for them. The people who have initiative will use that initiative to try and go somewhere else. And it is going to be very destabilizing, though, because when you have a lot of people moving around, they're not always welcome in the new places. There were a lot of signs in the Depression that communities put up saying, unemployed, keep going, don't get off the train here, we have nothing for you. And I think we're going to see that sort of thing happen again. People will be looking for opportunities, but they'll be few and far between and hard to find. And if you turn up in a place where you're not a known quantity and nobody knows whether they can trust you, it's going to be really, really hard to integrate into a new community.
Yeah.
Gail, you got some other thoughts you wanted to talk about on this level in terms of what's going to progress into the future?
Well, one of the things we were talking about was the generally timeline, and I think one of the big issues is this financial thing seems to be coming up very shortly. We seem to be right now approaching a situation where quite a few of the energy companies are going to have their September financial results going out and having reevaluating how much debt they can carry. We're going to have a lot of these. There's also the overseas debt, the dollar-denominated debt that's going to become more and more of a problem with the countries whose currencies are far below the dollar. So we're going to start seeing debt defaults starting, in the next couple of months probably, and I think things are going to start turning down rather quickly. We don't know exactly how this turns out, but it could turn out fairly quickly in terms of reducing the oil supply, the natural gas supply, and the coal supply all at once, because it turns out in response to less credit. And if the way the solution is made to try to save the banks is to reduce the size of people's deposits, that means they have less to spend, and that gets you into more of a deflationary cycle. So you're worse off than you were before, or it continues the deflation that we have. So you end up with more and more of these lower prices and more debt defaults. So the situation doesn't look good starting rather quickly. So if people are thinking about making changes, they probably want to start thinking about doing it pretty soon. Holding off for 2, 3 years, 4, 5, 6, and things are likely to be fairly different by that time.
Well, one of the
I completely agree with that.
Is, and this goes back to the 2008 crash, is the fact that there are any number of people, myself included, who looked at what was coming down the pipe in '08 and '09 and said, you know, this is coming down. And yet, somehow, with duct tape and, you know, baling wire and whatever, they managed to keep the biz together. And so the kind of complaints and issues that I get is, you know, when I say, you know, look, you know, this time's really it. Is, you know, I'm looked at as a kind of a Chicken Little, right? And, you know, and telling people that, you know, and I did in a recent article, a refugee article I wrote, that, you know, if you're going to make a move, now would be a good time. Because the opportunities to make the moves and make the changes are going to become much more restricted as we move down the line. But the thing is that people who currently have jobs and so forth, they don't, if there's a risk in giving up your job to try to move into some other type of arrangement, you know, and especially with people with families and so forth, young children, etc., to, you know, take on, to try to take on other lifestyles if they currently have a job, it puts everything at risk. It puts keeping their kids at risk. You know, I've talked with friends of mine, you know, about, you know, the idea of trying to live in a dry cabin and so forth in Alaska. You know, dry cabin means you don't have any running water or anything like that. And the fact is, if you try to do that in Alaska, the Department of Children's Services will come and take your kids away from you. You have to have hot and cold running water in your domicile in order to keep your kids, right? So the idea that you can shift off to a lower form of living, lower energy lifestyle, but still stay within inside the culture, it's just about impossible, right? So when you're making these predictions, you have to be kind of careful, you know, what you're saying. You know, how can I tell somebody, you know, yeah, I see this coming down the pipe, but should you risk giving up your job because I see this coming? You know, do I know that it's for sure going to happen in the next year? I mean, if I knew that for rock solid sure, then yeah, you know, I mean, do it now. But I don't know that for rock solid sure. And you know, it appears to me that, you know, they're out of ammo, and these things are imminent, if you will, within, say, the next year, you know. But, you know, that timeline business and how finance can be manipulated it's truly remarkable. And then you go back 35, 40 years, you know, and people say, you know, there was the Back to the Land hippie movement, you know, the guys who started the farm, Albert and those guys. And, you know, they kind of quit on the consumer culture of the era. But then, you know, of course, the farm survived in a certain fashion, but it changed a lot. But most of those types of arrangements failed in the end because the consumer culture marched on, didn't it? And nobody wanted to miss out on the party. So, you know, it's very difficult to make the changes that we know need to be made, but yet at the same time be able to operate inside the culture that we have and that currently still exists.
You need to put in both camps, and that means you're going to have all the work of both and not all the benefits of either in the transition period, which means it's going to be challenging. But people need to start putting a foot in the future that's actually going to happen, not the one they were promised, in order to make sure that they can transition to that when they have to. But I agree that it's going to be very difficult for people to jump completely into that kind of future, because often they are going to have to extract themselves from their current circumstances, and you can't do that all at once. And I would completely agree that the time scale is quite short. In terms of financial crisis, I think we could be looking at something really, really significant that doesn't have to take a long time to happen. So when you have a systemic banking crisis, the impact can be huge, and it can be from one day to the next. So we do have to really seriously think about these things and act now, or it will be too late. In some ways, there are some things that it's already too late.
Yeah.
But you can start, even if you're not going to be finished.
Well, I might add that I think that not everybody is into making transition movements and all of these things. Moving to, a dry cabin in Alaska is probably not for everybody. But there are people who have relatives that they could be making better connections with, or that they could move closer to. There are a whole lot of people who, are not working now and could be moving closer to their immediate families, or making contacts that are more aligned with people they already know, so as to have better resources or better backup.
Yeah, again, that's back to the community aspect and making connections with others, and developing a community family. Obviously, if you've got good family to to get together with, then that's usually the first line for most people. Unfortunately, in our modern era, families and family structures have become very dissected, I guess is the best word, cut apart. So oftentimes people don't have a lot of family that they can come in to back them up. And then the next thing is your friends, having close friends and so forth and whatnot. Another thing people don't have relationships with these days very much is neighbors. Who talks to their neighbors today? Very few people. And so, trying to forge some relationships on that level, I think, is important too. But that aspect of having one foot in each world is a tremendously difficult one to negotiate for anybody. My general suggestion over time is basically have a bug out package, a means of when the shit hits the fan and it really gets bad, that you can leave, especially if you're in a big city, leave the city and get out of town, get out of Dodge, get the fuck out of Dodge, and that's about the best you can do if you're in that situation. How can you advise somebody who's making $100,000 a year as a IT specialist somewhere in say Southern California or something like that, and it's going dry there, yeah, but he's going to give up $100,000 a year job to go where, so this is the difficulty of negotiating this transition for everybody. It's extreme.
Yes.
And it's something only the individual can decide for themselves what is appropriate, if you will. At some point, and I agree with both of you, we really appear on the cusp. The last couple of weeks, and watching the rapidity of the changes in Forex, having traded in Forex myself, the kind of movements that are going on now, if you're on the wrong side of that trade, you can go bust really fast, and that is no doubt happening to people. And so next week's going to be very interesting. But predicting the future, always a difficult task in this business. All you can say for sure is that tomorrow is going to be a little worse than today. To give you guys a chance before we go to say any last words and testament, and then we will hopefully be back with part 3 that we skipped over sometime during the week. But Gail, you got any last words you want to drop on us?
Not right now, thank you.
Yeah, okay. Nicole?
Well, I think this next few years are going to be remembered as a time of financial crisis, and people have been warned about this for a long, long time, but it was too easy to believe for most people that the system would continue. So despite the fact that people got an extra 5 years to prepare, not a lot of people took advantage of that circumstance. They went back to sleep again, which I think is really unfortunate. Human beings only tend to have two operating modes. There's complacency, and then there's panic, and there's not very much in between. But I think we really, really needed to develop an informed sense of urgency, and some people did, and some people have made tremendous changes in their own lives, and will be much better off in the future as a result, but an awful lot of people didn't. And so I think we're going to be headed for a very serious period of crisis, unfortunately. And we're hitting so many limits at once, but not everything operates over the same time frame. I think the time frame for finance is very short, and we're going to be seeing things happening really quite soon. The time scale for energy is somewhat longer. The time scale for everything in the real world is somewhat longer because finance is virtual, so it doesn't really exist in a lot of ways. It can change incredibly quickly. The real world takes longer. Politics takes longer than that. And eventually we end up with the potential for conflict. And it's a tremendously sad thing to contemplate, but I do think that we are in a position where there's not going to be enough to go around for everyone to satisfy what they think they've been promised. And conflict is a distinct possibility. But the greater the extent to which we can foster the small-scale cooperation that is possible, the more we reduce the potential for conflict. And being able to prevent it, I think, is probably unlikely. But if we can do our best, it's all that can be expected, and we can significantly mitigate what's coming if we take the kind of actions that do lie within solution space.
I agree. Monse, you got any closing words?
I think, it's just in terms of predicting the future, it's very difficult to see when it will happen, and lots of people will be shocked, and I think the shock is going to be part of the problem because there's going to be a lot of anger and so forth. But those are just challenges that communities will have to face, and there are personal things that will have to be faced head on. But otherwise, I agree a lot with what Nicole said. A lot of people, they're just going to be complacent. They didn't really take advantage of the extra time, and it's either doing nothing or panicking. So I agree with that.
All right. Well, so we looked a little bit about the future, a little bit towards the future here today in this last segment of the Shit Hits the Fan Collapse Cafe. And we will try to get back to you with part 3 sometime this week if we can. Otherwise, for myself on a personal note, I have personal collapse going on here. And I'm going to be heading in to have the pros from Dover cover up my neck in the next week. So I don't know if we don't get back on, I don't know the next time I will be back, but I'll be back. And in the meantime, save as many as you can. And that's all to do this time. Until next time, here on the Collapse Cafe. Later.